Hello and welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we try to build a more robust and credible case for conservation by asking some of the more difficult questions in this field. In this episode, I'm joined by Michelle Marvier to discuss whether modern conservation might be a little too conservative. Michelle is a professor at the Department of Environmental Studies and Sciences at Santa Clara University in California. She's authored or co-authored more than 60 peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, and edited books, including a textbook on conservation science. Several of her publications are in top journals like Science and Nature, and often focusing on topics that challenge some of the less well-supported orthodoxy in this field. Michelle and I didn't know each other before I invited her onto the podcast, so I'm especially grateful for her willingness, her time, and the enjoyable discussion that you're about to listen in on. I wanted to start off by asking how you became involved in conservation in the first place and how that led to where you are now, more or less what your career path has been.
I actually started as a pure ecologist. My graduate program was in biology, and I studied parasitic plants, the ecology of parasitic plants. So it had nothing to do with conservation, and probably 8 people ever read the papers that I published. um, I got into conservation a little bit by accident because my postdoc project was this really big field experiment out on Mount St. Helens, and it was a lot of work and it completely failed. And so I was floundering, and I got into learning a little bit of modeling and thinking about risk assessment for BT crops. So really big segue, a really big jump in my career path because basically my big postdoc experiment bombed. And I went into that work really against genetically modified crops, really thinking that they were very problematic and very risky. And over the years of diving into the data, my mind was changed. And that was a really exciting thing to realize, like, the data can send me in a new direction. I felt pretty good about that. I also started working on some salmon demography. This all seems very unrelated to each other. I've actually bounced around quite a bit, but I like to use math and statistics to solve problems. And so that's sort of the connection or theme here. So I was involved in some population modeling of salmon, and we were looking specifically at the question of dam removal on the Snake River. And we published a very interesting paper on that front that, again, I went into this thinking the dams are horrible. The dams have got to go because the salmon are getting clobbered. And our demographic model showed that even if we had 100% survival during the migration, both downstream and upstream, the populations were still probably going to be declining. So environmental groups had really painted that as a silver bullet solution. And we found it probably wasn't going to be sufficient on its own. And in fact, in many ways, it might be worse because there was such good survival during the fish transport and the bypass systems that had been put in place. It actually could have gotten worse if they removed 4 of the 8 dams, because then the salmon would still have to swim through the bottom 4 rather than get transported all the way down to the mouth of the Columbia River. So that was another, like, wow, I was not expecting this result. We followed the data, and it's challenging when you find something that doesn't quite agree with your own preconceived notions. And so since then, I've been involved in a number of different things. We did some global priority setting for conservation, some papers looking at what we called biodiversity cold spots, because we felt all the attention to biodiversity hotspots was really ignoring some of these very important ecosystems that had relatively few native plant species. And so they were getting left off the maps, but they clearly were very valuable areas. And over the years, I've been teaching some 20 years at an undergraduate program. I am not at a research university, and I don't have grad students and postdocs, but I continue to try and do these projects that use existing data or reanalyze existing data or synthesize things in new ways. And so I've also co-authored a textbook, which I felt would be a really good way to try to shift the conversation in conservation a little bit, and create, like really give students a sense that this is a field with a lot of controversy, a lot of unanswered questions. It's a very interesting field. It's not like all the answers are already there, it's all solved. So it's been a very weird path forward.
And don't you think that aspect of conservation, the fact that there are so many unanswered questions and the fact that there is controversy and uncertainty, that does make it more interesting, doesn't it? I think not just to students, but perhaps to the general public who's absorbing facts about conservation.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a very lively field. There's a lot to still be discovered and figured out, and I think it's much more engaging for the students, especially, and can really draw more students into the field. And I felt like the textbooks that were out there kind of presented everything as these are the facts. This is
Mhm.
what a minimum effective population size is, and there wasn't a lot of let's debate this. This is actually something where there's really diverse opinions, and we could have a great conversation about this,
Mm.
and try and work through it.
That brings me very neatly to the next question, which was you and colleagues like Peter Kereiva are known for embracing skepticism in conservation science and for being critical of or of accepting opinion as fact. Correct me if I'm representing you incorrectly here, but that's my kind of interpretation of the way that you guys approach things. And you've also, as you've mentioned, you've focused attention on projects that help to foster this kind of thinking, like the textbook that you mentioned. And I know that there's another book that you've also been working on, which addresses this very squarely. My question, though, was why do you think there is a lack of skepticism in conservation? And why do you think it's so important to address that lack of skepticism?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know why there seems to be a little bit of resistance, I would say, within the field to questioning some of the core assumptions. That has been my experience, at least. It is different from other scientific disciplines in that it is a mission-driven discipline. And, it was very clear from the beginning when the foundational papers for the discipline were written that this was going to be different. This is a discipline that is an expression of human values. Certain things are held dear. So I don't know if that contributes to maybe some defensiveness when the core values are questioned, or when we maybe say, maybe there's more than one way that we could solve this problem, and maybe some of the ways we might solve this problem are less opposed to what people need. So I think sometimes there's this tension in conservation that sort of it's nature versus people, and people are the problem. But in reality, people are also the only solution. This is fundamentally an expression of human values, and people have to be on board with whatever solutions we're going to be able to implement. And I really don't think conservation can succeed if it doesn't also meet basic human needs. So I do think there's a little bit of defensiveness, and I think conservationists are very comfortable with confronting opposition from outside the field. It's the conservationists versus the developers. It's the conservationists versus resource extraction companies. But when the questions come from within the discipline, I think that was very uncomfortable for some of the people who especially founded the discipline.
Mm. It is actually also very much the focus of the podcast. The reason why I started this was because I had noticed some quite specific claims and assertions that were being made without really data to back them up. So really more based on expert opinion than on data. So, and I agree that that's not where we want to head.
Yeah, I think it's important to address it because I care, because I love nature, and because I want to see a vibrant future for humanity and nature. And in order to get the answers right, we have to ask the hard questions. We have to dig in and say, what does the data actually say? The received wisdom is not enough. We need to question everything about why are we doing what we're doing? What are our goals? Why do we think this is the best approach? Why are we resistant to other alternative approaches? What are the real risks involved in not acting? What are the risks involved in all the alternative actions? We need to just question everything. And it's because I love nature and I want nature to be around for generations and generations and generations of people, like really vibrant nature.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, of course, nature will always be there at some level, but like just the kind of inspiring nature that I grew up with.
Mm-hmm.
I want future generations to have that too.
Was your career choice at the very beginning inspired partly by that feeling of being in nature?
Yeah, I knew from a very young age that I wanted to do something in biology. I don't know that I knew what conservation was when I was a kid, but I loved nature. And it's interesting, the nature I grew up with is not what a lot of conservation biologists would consider very high quality nature. I grew up in South San Francisco near the airport, and there's a hill there that's got just a whole bunch of European weeds primarily. There's a few native things there, but that is the nature I grew up loving. And I had a German Shepherd collie, and I would take him up on those hills and we would roam around in there. And to me, it was transcendent beauty. I mean, it was amazing. And I fell in love with nature. And I think that's one of the things that continues to inspire me is that it doesn't have to be super pristine. We're not all going to make it to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. I want it to exist. I'm probably never going to set foot there, but I also care about the nature that's in our midst, and it's messy nature. It's highly invaded and manipulated, and it's been loved to death, and people have done all sorts of things to it. But it's still really important that we have that, and it's important for the species too. It's not just important for us.
Just to segue a little bit, another focus of yours, perhaps more recently, has been about the need to be a bit less risk averse in conservation. And first of all, I wanted to ask, what kind of risks are you referring to when you're making this suggestion?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about whether conservation might be too conservative. We tend to have certain approaches, solutions that we think are good, and we want to just stick with those, like protected areas, like sort of tried and true, and people are comfortable with it. Set land aside from people, and this is not a controversial approach within conservation. It may be controversial in other realms, but it's not controversial within conservation. But there's so many other things we might be trying right now, and I think it is time to really start taking these options very seriously. Climate change is happening so much faster than anybody anticipated. The nitrogen cycle is completely out of whack because of humanity. You can find pollutants in organisms out in the most remote areas of the world. So our impacts are everywhere at this point. And, the situation for corals is just heartbreaking, right? I mean, the risks are so real and so imminent. And it's interesting that in that situation, people have started to say, let's start looking at some of these alternative solutions. So the risks that are involved often are things like, if we're going to move a species to an area where we think it will do well in the future climate, well, that's basically saying, let's do an intentional species introduction. And so there's all these risks that people have been talking about for introduced species for a very long time. It could become invasive. It could disrupt the ecosystem. But we know if we don't do anything, the species will go extinct. And so that's the trade-off we're trying to balance here. And I think conservation has been very conservative. It's really not willing to go out on a limb and take these kinds of risks that there could be unintended consequences.
In a recent article that you and Peter wrote, you talk about two overarching reasons for taking more and bigger risks in conservation. The one of those being, as you alluded to a moment ago, the urgency of the situation, the speed of climate change and global change in general. And then the other was the fact that we have made a lot of progress in being able to predict what the outcomes are going to be of conservation actions, whereas in the 1970s and 80s and even 90s, we might have had a much less clear idea and a much less clear understanding of ecology, I guess, in general. Would you like to kind of expand on those two overarching reasons maybe a little bit?
Yeah, I think the effects of climate change are really clear, right? It's obvious that we are, no matter what we do, no matter how fast we start to ramp down the greenhouse gas emissions, there's a certain amount of warming that's a foregone conclusion, and it's more than we would like to see, and it's going to happen very rapidly, possibly with positive feedback loops that are going to make it even worse. So I think there's really clear data that we know that this is a risk, and we have to kind of weigh that against the risks of taking various actions, but those risks are, they're not as certain. We don't know that those risks are going to happen, but also we have gotten a little bit better at knowing what risks to look for and how to screen for them in advance. So a good example of this is there was a seed weevil that was introduced to North America to control some invasive thistles with the goal of helping the native thistles. But unfortunately, the seed weevil was not very specific in its diet. And so it not only reduced the reproduction of the invasive thistles, but it also started attacking the native thistles. And there's a lot of examples of this, that we basically blew it, right? We we made introductions and they went sideways. But I think now we know a lot. We've learned a lot from those mistakes that, oh, you really need to look at the diet specificity of these organisms before you release them. And there's obviously always going to be things that are unpredictable and we couldn't see it coming. But I do think we've gotten better at sort of screening out the big issues. We've also gotten better in terms of the methods that we use to help organisms adapt to the environment. So it's not just introducing species, but it also could be artificial selection to help a species survive that warmer climate better, or even genetically engineering those organisms. And this is something in the coral community that's really getting a serious look. Should we be genetically engineering, if not the coral polyps themselves, maybe the symbionts that live inside of them? And in the past, we would have done that with like hybridizing things or using a mutagen, and it may have the impact we want, and it may do a whole bunch of other things. It's really uncontrolled.
Shotgun
And
approach.
now, yeah, and now we have these much more precise tools, especially with CRISPR. I know it's not quite as clean, maybe. There could be some things that are disrupted, but it's so much more precise than the older methods that we would have used in the past. And so you would know we're only introducing this one gene. We know exactly where it is. We know exactly where the promoter is, And so I think we have a lot better ability to both solve the problems. We have more precise methods, but we also have better ability to test for possible unintended consequences.
So it reminds me of, there's a quote by the American economist Thomas Sowell that I came across. I think it's quite a well-known quote, but I just came across it recently. He said, "There are no solutions, only trade-offs." And I think that applies so neatly to this situation because you can never be sure or either way of how things are going to turn out. So it's a case of probability, right? And how we're enhancing our predictive capacity.
Yeah, in some cases, I think you have more certainty that inaction will lead to an extinction. I think we can often have more certainty on one side of that equation. And yes, there's going to be some possible unintended consequences by taking an action. But how do we weigh that? It's like, we know if we do nothing, it will result in something very negative, and we know whose fault it is. Versus, should we go ahead and try and tinker and really not just set up a protected area and let nature run its course, but do something that's a little bit more interventionist, really move things around, help things evolve fast enough. You could even think of this maybe applying to geoengineering, although I don't know much about geoengineering.
I can imagine that part of the hesitancy is because you are probably going to be less likely to be held accountable for something that you don't do than something that you do, right?
I totally think that might be a huge part of it. Yeah, we were thinking of trying to do some interviews with resource managers, land managers, and people are on the ground and ask, like, why would you hesitate to do these things? I think that there's not just responsibility, but also liability.
Mm-hmm.
That somebody could point to you and say, you introduced this thing and now it's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that does hold people back a lot.
I can imagine. We're human beings after all.
Yeah, nobody really wants that on their head. But on the other hand, if we do nothing, we pretty much know what's going to happen.
I understand that we're becoming better at predicting outcomes, but at the same time, as you mentioned, the world is changing faster than ever before. So do you think that the fact that the world is changing and environments are changing faster than ever before, do you think that to some extent counteracts the ability to predict? That it becomes a little bit more difficult to predict because environments are changing, or do you think that our predictive capacity is evolving more quickly than that is?
That's a good question. I suspect that there's going to be a lot of change that we did not predict, that we
Mm-hmm.
didn't see coming. But that's something that conservationists need to come to accept, I think. There's a lot of resistance to the idea that things are going to change a lot very rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
Conservation is largely about trying to keep things the way they were. And how you define the time is different in different locations, I think. Here in North America, it's a lot about before colonization. We'd really like to restore this to how it was before European colonization.
Mm-hmm.
That's harder to do in other parts of the world. But I think conservationists generally resist the idea that the world is very dynamic. They don't. They say they get it. Like, yeah, of course, nature's not in equilibrium and everything's changing all the time. But really, when you look at conservation goals, it's often to restore something back to or keep something the way it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
Karen Pawani did some research looking at. She was working with land managers and their specific parcel of land that they work with and looking at climate projections for those areas and showing people really an intense workshop looking at how the temperature and the climate was going to change where they work, and therefore the species that are there are going to change. And then after going through all that, asking people like, how does that change your management plans? The vast majority of the managers still wanted to manage for resistance. They didn't want any change to occur. They wanted to try and prevent change, or they would manage for resilience. How are we going to get the community to bounce back to this healthy state, this normative good state? And very few people were willing to entertain ideas of transformation, that this ecosystem is going to be a different kind of ecosystem down the road.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very challenging for conservationists to think that way, that
Right.
this is going to be a fundamentally different world.
In the article, you also made some recommendations on how to proceed with this philosophy in mind. And by this philosophy, I mean the philosophy of being a bit less precautionary. And there were 4 ideas that you put forth there, and I wanted to just ask if you could kind of expand on those a little bit. The first was that we should give more weight to the intended consequences of conservation action. The second is that we shouldn't be overly influenced by failure, by really disastrous outcomes that have happened in the past. The third was that we should be encouraged by data on successes, looking at the data rather than and I guess this is sort of a counterpart to the second point. This is the other side of that coin. And then lastly, and I think you said this was the most important, and I think I agree, that we should recognize the social consequences of inaction. So I guess what you mean by that last one is that even if inaction is the plan and the outcome of inaction is biodiversity conservation, that might still result in severely undesirable social consequences.
I think the fourth one I would have said is something a little bit different. But let me try and go from the top again and see if I can say anything about these. So, yeah, we suggest that there should be more weight to the intended consequences, and by that we mean people fret an awful lot about the unintended consequences. There's a lot of papers that write, we can't possibly try a translocation. We can't use seeds that aren't native to this area for this restoration project because all these things could go wrong. And that's true, but a lot of things often go right. And if you look at the accumulated number of case studies of conservationists intervening in nature for a particular intended outcome, they often achieve it. But somehow, like the few, I think relatively few examples where things don't go well and there's a real problem tend to overshadow the many examples when people intervene and it actually works out the way they had intended. And then yeah, that sort of segues into the second point, which is that we shouldn't allow a few failures from a relatively distant past to sort of dominate our thinking about intervention. There are a couple of really well-known examples. I think everybody knows the cane toad example, and that comes up almost every time you have a conversation about conservationists intervening in nature. And so yeah, there's definitely cases where things didn't go well at all, but those few examples seem to loom really large in our imagination and tend to dominate things an awful lot.
Just for those who are
Yeah.
not familiar with the cane toad example, I'm sure all the conservationists in the audience will be, but that's similar to the weevil example that you provided. If I remember correctly, in Australia they brought these cane toads in, I don't know where from, but they brought them into Australia to control a pest, and then they ended up overtaking the ecosystem. That's a very simplistic overview, but more or less right.
Yeah, they were meant to control a pest of sugarcane, and they have a toxin in their skin. Well, there was many problems. They don't even feed at the same time when this pest was active, so it had all kinds of horrible effects. But they also have this toxin in their skin, and so they ended up poisoning a lot of the wildlife that ate them. It's an ecological disaster for sure.
On
So
all
we
fronts.
shouldn't downplay that. I mean, we should learn from it, but we shouldn't downplay it, and we shouldn't let it dominate our thinking that like every time we intervene in nature, it turns out that badly, because it often turns out really well. And we've saved many species by intervening. For example, bringing there's a subspecies here in the United States, the Florida panther, which was on the brink of extinction due to inbreeding depression, and bringing in some individuals from a distinct subpopulation from the Texas population and having them interbreed, interjected new life into the gene pool, and it's helped them to recover in amazing ways. So we often have that beneficial effect on nature that we're hoping for, and things do often work out well. But somehow those negative examples kind of
Dominate.
overshadow a lot of the good that has been done. Our third point is really quite related, which is that there's a lot of data that shows we can do things well. Some of our interventions have worked out very well, and we should let that data speak and drive our future choices. For example, we've been using BT crops very effectively to control pests, and there's been no evidence of ecological harm or harm to human health. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that all genetic modifications we could ever do in the future will be benign, but we should feel some confidence that we have all this accumulated data. And then the final thing has to do with social consequences and unintended consequences on society. Conservationists tend to think about unintended consequences for the ecosystems, but when we intervene, there's often consequences for people. And some of the strategies that are considered very not controversial within conservation, such as setting up a protected area, can actually have huge unintended consequences for people who are displaced from the area. Maybe they can no longer hunt or use the resources there. And we've been, I wouldn't say completely blind to that, but it hasn't been the top priority. And so really getting people involved from the beginning to talk about what are the goals and what are the acceptable risks, not just for nature, but for the human community. Getting them involved very early in those conversations, I think, would be a big improvement.
Involving the stakeholders. Yeah, that's a phrase that you often hear in conservation, also in my sort of corner of the field, which is more policy oriented. And I think there are movements in that direction, but I don't think as many as there need to be, right? I think we're still kind of in the infancy of that movement.
I agree, and I think it's often after the fact. It's like, oh, well, we've done this intervention. Now let's bring in a social scientist to study how this has impacted people, rather than really involving people from the beginning. And that's starting to happen. I agree with you. It's starting to happen.
The example that you gave about protected areas is not necessarily an example of inaction having unintended consequences, but do you have any examples of situations where inaction has led to unintended outcomes?
Yeah, because I do think our final, that's why I said that I would phrase that final point a little bit differently. It was, I think, more about actions rather than inactions.
Right.
So yes, there are definitely situations where we had the opportunity to do something like we did for the Florida panther, bring in individuals from a different subspecies or try to intervene in some way to help the species move it to a new location, and we've been reluctant to do so. A really good example of this is the island scrub jay, which is a species that's endemic to some small islands off the coast of California. And currently it's only on one island, and there's a proposal to introduce it to a second island that has enough of a different climate that people think it could buffer the population and help it to survive. And conservationists are all worked up and anxious about whether this would be a reintroduction of a species that naturally went extinct or a reintroduction of a species that we drove to extinction. And that distinction seems to matter a heck of a lot. And I think it shouldn't matter because yeah, this is a species that's only on one island. It's potentially at risk because of West Nile virus as the climate is warming. Having it on a second island that's cooler and less likely to have West Nile virus seems like a no-brainer. But we're so risk averse, and I don't even know what the risks would be, but because it seems like it seems like it would probably be a positive for the species and for the ecosystem. But somehow we're just fearful of intervening to reverse what was maybe a natural extinction rather than a human-caused one.
And just to get back to GMO for a second, as far as I understand, you've written quite a lot on that particular subject, the risks of GMO or the absence of risks of GMO. And you mentioned a couple of examples earlier, but could I ask you to expand a little bit on that, or just perhaps give a couple of additional examples of how we should be a bit more bold in using that tool in our toolbox?
Yeah, well, I think the American chestnut's a great example where genetic modification is working and has been successful. So a gene has been moved from wheat into the American chestnut, and it gives it resistance to the fungus that causes chestnut blight. And this is a species that is clearly important for the ecosystem, produces this really rich food source that lots of animals relied upon, humans relied upon, both for the nuts and also the wood. People love the American chestnut and want to bring it back. And there's been a couple of different approaches that are being taken. One involves hybridization, and the other is genetic modification. And people just have this innate fear of the genetic modification just because it's genetic modification, but it's actually far more precise. There's only one gene that's being moved. It's known exactly where it was inserted into the genome. The tree is 99.99% American chestnut with one gene from wheat. And when you do the hybridization and then the back crossing with the Asian species of chestnut, it's not going to get back to being 99.9% American chestnut. It's now a new entity, and you don't really know what things have been disrupted nearly as precisely. So that's an example where I think a lot of progress is happening right now, and we may be seeing genetically modified chestnuts being planted out into nature soon.
When I spent time in Canada, I remember the city of Montreal, which is where I was based. The environment department there was mostly involved with the emerald ash borer problem. So that's an invertebrate, I think, from Asia, which is really decimating the ash population in the city and then beyond the city as well, and across North America, right? It's not just a northeast thing. Is there any possibility of treating that with something that's perhaps a bit risky, but has promise?
I don't know the specifics on that, but I would think that if the chestnut succeeds in getting across all the regulatory hurdles and is accepted and planted on a broad enough scale, I think that would definitely pave the way for other solutions like that. But it's not just conservationists that tend to not have an open mind about that. That's the general public as well tends to be very fearful of genetic modification, but it is in fact a lot more precise. And I have to say, this was a big evolution for me. I started out really, really against genetic modification for ethical reasons. I thought we shouldn't be tinkering with nature in that way. But when you start to think about the ways we tinker with nature all the time that are completely not thought out, changing the whole climate of the earth, and various other things we do, this actually can be very targeted and I think
Hmm.
could be used to do a lot of good.
And then by contrast, as you say, we have been tinkering for a long time, and when pastoralists moved to being agriculturalists, they were already starting that process, right? Just by selecting the plants which produce the biggest tomatoes or wild relatives of tomatoes or whatever it was, right? That process had already begun then. What you said now reminded me, I wanted to ask, just to end off perhaps, a question about something you said right at the beginning and to stay on the topic of genetic engineering. You said that you decided to look at a question involving genetic modification, even though you were against it. And I was just wondering, why did you decide to do that? Did you enter into it thinking you were going to prove something in particular, or were you simply curious about it, or how did that process sort of unfold?
Yeah, so my PhD work really was about plant insect interactions. I was looking at parasitic plants and how they interacted with their herbivores. And so one of the risks people were concerned about for BT crops was that if the genes for the BT toxin were to get out into wild relatives, would that make them invasive? And how would that change given the dynamics between the plants and the herbivores? So that was sort of my pure research interest, was to use my plant herbivore interactions methodologies to understand this. But I did go into it thinking that this probably would reveal that there were big problems. Early on, I started looking at the studies that the EPA, I actually used the Freedom of Information Act here in the US as a way to get the government to share documents with you that they might not otherwise. So I used the Freedom of Information Act to get all these studies from the EPA to see what was which is our Environmental Protection Agency.
Hmm.
I wanted to see what were the data that they were using in order to make the determinations that these BT crops were safe for non-target invertebrates. And when I dug into it, I found that the data were really thin. A lot of the studies were being done by the corporations who had a financial interest in a particular answer. And the studies often would have like 4 replicates, like 4 batches of worms that were being exposed to BT cotton and 4 batches of worms that were being exposed to control
Hmm.
non-transgenic cotton. And I thought, wow, if we did a drug trial and we had 4 people exposed to the drug and 4 people exposed to a placebo, nobody would say that this had been well tested and that this was safe.
Hmm.
And yet that's what they were deciding. So learning that, was really convinced that I was going to do this meta-analysis and pull together all the data, and it would show that there were harms of BT crops on non-target invertebrates. And I pulled all the data together, and lo and behold, nope. The BT crops not only did not have harmful effects, but they were vastly safer for the non-target invertebrates than spraying broad-spectrum pesticides,
Hmm.
which in retrospect is completely obvious because broad-spectrum pesticides kill everything in the field, especially it would also kill people, right? I mean, there's exposure to humans there that I wasn't considering as well. And the BT toxins in the BT corn and cotton are so specific that it's just particular orders of insects that are going to be harmed.
Hmm.
And so it's a vast improvement over what we had been doing.
Something that I often think about as well is how in the medical field, you made the comparison, the theoretical comparison with if that had been a medical experiment, it would never have been considered. I think that in the medical profession, of course, it's also far from perfect, but I find that it's a useful yardstick for conservation. I guess we'll never get to the level of precision that you can in the medical profession, but perhaps that's the kind of thing that we should be aiming a little bit closer for.
Yeah, there's a movement now toward evidence-based conservation, just as there was a movement toward evidence-based medicine.
Hmm.
And it was hard for many medical practitioners to say, you want me to just follow raw numbers? This is an art. You have to know the patient. You have to feel the lump. It was very hands-on, and
Hmm.
now you're telling me I should just do whatever the meta-analysis tells me. And so there's a lot of resistance to just following the data in medicine.
Hmm.
But it's become the norm now, and certainly there's a number of people pushing for that in conservation as well, that we should follow the data.
Okay, so that's it for the discussion, but you can find links to some of the things that were discussed in the show notes of the podcast or on the episode page of the Case for Conservation website. That's Case for Conservation using the number 4. Next time I'll be talking about cities and asking my guest, Deborah Roberts, why they are not given more credit or support for their role in biodiversity conservation, and on the other hand, why should they be? Deborah is a biodiversity and climate scientist who's spent most of her career working at the city level and influencing how the world sees the role of cities in both biodiversity conservation and climate change action. She's also co-chair of one of the working groups of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. That promises to be a rich and illuminating discussion, so I hope that you can join us.